In early August in the year 216 BC, the Roman Republic faced its gravest threat. On the second day of that month, an army of Carthaginians from North Africa had virtually annihilated a Roman army, killing or capturing at least 50,000 men at the Battle of Cannae in southeastern Italy, just across the peninsula from where Naples is today, and not too far either from Rome itself. The Carthaginians had been commanded by one of Rome's greatest nemeses, the Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca. Hannibal had already scored several victories over the Romans since he first descended into the peninsula with an army after marching over the Alps in 218 BC. But the defeat at Cannae was on a different level. Now, many of Rome's subject cities across Italy, like Capua and Tarentum, abandoned Rome and allied with the Carthaginians, believing the Romans were doomed. In Rome itself, human sacrifices were offered in desperation to try to appease the gods, and the emergency power of dictatores was bestowed on a Roman general, Marcus Junius Pera, in light of the military emergency. How had it come to this? Who was this Hannibal, and how had he managed to bring the war directly into Italy? Furthermore, how did the Romans escape the bind they were in after Cannae? Here we look at the life of Hannibal and his clashes with Rome. Before looking at Hannibal, let's just briefly examine the geopolitical context and the rivalry between Rome and Carthage in the 3rd century BC. Hannibal and his family were at the very forefront of the power struggle which was underway between the Roman Republic and the oligarchic state of Carthage in the 3rd century BC. Rome had gradually emerged in the 5th and 4th centuries BC, from being a republic that controlled little more than the city of Rome itself and some surrounding territory in the Latium region of central Italy, to become the preeminent power of the Italian peninsula, conquering neighbours such as the Etruscans and Samnites, to expand north into Tuscany and south to Neapolis, modern-day Naples and the Campania region. This brought them close to the sphere of influence of Carthage. Carthage had been founded on the site of modern-day Tunis in Tunisia in North Africa as a colony of the Phoenicians of the Levant in the late 9th century BC. It gradually expanded to become a major mercantile and military power in the western Mediterranean, with one of its explorers, Hanno the Navigator, even voyaging well down the western coast of Africa in the 5th century BC, when Rome was still just a provincial backwater. But by the early 3rd century BC, Rome was ascendant. Carthage controlled the Italian islands of Sardinia and Sicily by that time, and after Rome expanded into the south reaches of the Italian peninsula, a war between the two nations seemed inevitable. Sicily was the ostensible prize they went to war over in 264 BC, but what was really at stake was the position as the hegemonic power of the Western Mediterranean. The First Punic War would last 23 years, continuing until 241 BC. Part of the reason for its length was that Rome was the greater land power, while Carthage was the more formidable naval power. It consequently took years for the Romans to diversify into building a fleet of galleys before they could defeat the Carthaginians. At the end of the war they emerged victorious, and the islands of Sicily and Sardinia became Rome's first overseas territories. Corsica was soon occupied as well by the Romans. Hannibal's father, Hamilcar Barca, was a prominent general in the latter years of the war, commanding the Carthaginian war effort in Sicily. This was the geopolitical environment into which Hannibal was born. Hannibal is generally believed to have been born in or around the year 247 BC, the year that his father took over command of the Carthaginian forces in Sicily during the First Punic War. He was born into the Barcid family, one of the most influential aristocratic families in Carthage at the time. In addition to his father acting as a major military commander in Sicily, Hannibal's uncle, Mago Barca, had led an expedition to Italy during the First Punic War. Carthage was an oligarchy, a sort of aristocratic republic, not entirely dissimilar to the Roman Republic, where the patrician class ruled over the majority of the people by controlling the Senate, the Roman political assembly. Hannibal was still a child when the First Punic War ended in Rome's victory over Carthage. This was not the end of the rivalry between the two states, though. Carthage had suffered a huge setback, but it was still a powerful mercantile and military power, controlling extensive territory in North Africa, around parts of modern-day Tunisia, Algeria, and western Libya, and also with an extensive trading empire, which meant it could recover quickly to challenge Rome again one day. Hannibal's father would be at the forefront of the quest for revenge. According to the Greek historian Polybius, when Hannibal was just a boy, his father made him and his brother, Hasdrubal, swear an oath that they would live their lives to seek revenge against the Romans. It was an oath which Hannibal and Hasdrubal would take very seriously, and when they were barely teenagers they were already being trained in the art of warfare at Carthage, and in the territories it controlled. As Hannibal grew up, he would have become increasingly aware that his father had a strategy for seeking revenge against Rome. Moreover, he had managed to convince the aristocratic families that controlled Carthage of the wisdom of his policy. Hamilcar's plan was to compensate for the loss of Sicily and Sardinia by acquiring new territories to the west in what was then called Hispania, but which we know as Spain today. The country here did not have a powerful state that needed to be challenged like Rome in Italy or the Greek powers to the east. Instead, it was a soft target, but one which had extensive mineral mines that could be exploited, and numerous significant port cities that had been established along its Mediterranean coastline by the Greeks and Phoenicians in centuries gone by. Thus, in the course of the 230s and 220s BC, after the First Punic War ended, Hamilcar began leading armies to Hispania and conquering extensive portions of the Iberian Peninsula. Once they were of age, Hannibal and his brother Hasdrubal joined him in the effort. They were very young when their military careers began. The concept of being a teenager is a modern one, and in ancient times people were deemed to enter their adult years when they reached 13 or 14 years of age. Thus, Hannibal and Hasdrubal were active in military service from what would seem like an extremely young age by today's standards. Eventually, when their father died in 228 BC, the two brothers became the leaders of the Carthaginian expansion in Hispania, by which time Hannibal was about 19 years old. This entire campaign has left some lasting legacies. It is, for instance, believed by many scholars that the name of the city of Barcelona is derived from Hannibal's family's name, Barca. By the end of the 220s BC, the two brothers had conquered most of the Mediterranean coastline of Hispania and expanded further inland and into what is now the French Riviera, acquiring allies here in the region between the Pyrenees and the Alps. With these gains made, they began plotting to implement their father's grand strategy to use the new lands conquered in Hispania and the resources gained there to wage a fresh war against the Romans. The descent towards war began in 220 BC, when Hannibal's brother-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair, who somewhat confusingly had the same name as Hannibal's biological brother and who was more open to a diplomatic approach to Rome, was assassinated. This left Hannibal more firmly in charge of Carthaginian policy in Hispania, and he was determined to go to war with the Romans and fulfill his father's vow of revenge. In 219 BC, Rome ratcheted up tensions first by supporting a pro-Roman coup in the city of Saguntum, inside what was Carthage's territory in Hispania. This led Hannibal to militarily occupy the city, and a subsequent ultimatum arrived to Carthage from Rome, calling for Hannibal's arrest for his actions. Thus, there were elements of Roman aggression in the outbreak of the Second Punic War, though Hannibal confirmed the outbreak of war when in 218 BC he took the Romans by surprise by marching overland from Hispania through southern France, or Gaul as it was then known, over the Alps and into northern Italy, to attack Rome by land. He was facilitated in this by alliances with the Celts of southern Gaul and the Alpine region, though the extent to which he crossed the Alps with war elephants brought from North Africa has been somewhat exaggerated. These were a feature of his army, but just a small one designed more to incite psychological terror when the elephants charged a Roman battle line than to actually make a substantial difference in the overall war effort. In any event, the descent into the Italian peninsula from the north and by land took the Romans, who had expected a naval invasion of Sicily or southern Italy by the Carthaginians from North Africa, completely by surprise. Thus in 218, 217 and 216 BC, Hannibal managed to win a series of stunning victories over the Romans, culminating, as we saw at the beginning, in the Battle of Cannae in the late summer of 216 BC. With this, Rome stood on the precipice of defeat, and Hannibal was on the cusp of fulfilling his father's great dream. Despite the perilous situation which the Roman Republic stood in after the Battle of Cannae, Hannibal was unable to strike the killer blow. If there was a flaw in his military approach, it was overt caution, and even after Cannae he felt his forces were insufficient to capture the city of Rome itself. If he had attacked the city then, the history of the ancient world may have played out very differently. Yet he didn't, and the Romans were able to regroup in the course of 215 BC. They conscripted more citizens, galvanized the support of some of their remaining friends, and made diplomatic overtures to acquire new allies amongst the enemies of the Carthaginians in both Hispania and North Africa. One ally that they acquired in particular was crucial. This was Massinissa, the king of the Numidians, a Berber people native to North Africa, who controlled much of the more inland parts of the region, and who were a perennial enemy of the Carthaginians, emerging out of the Atlas Mountains to attack the more sedentary, mercantile Carthaginians in their coastal settlements. By winning over the Numidians to their side, the Romans were able to ensure that the Carthaginians could not adequately reinforce Hannibal in Italy, as they needed much of their available forces at home in Africa to fight off the raids by the Berbers. In this scenario, the war devolved into something of a stalemate. Hannibal spent years in Italy, where he continued to control territory, though the possibility of capturing Rome had passed by the late 210s BC. Meanwhile, the Romans counteracted his presence in Italy by sending their own expeditions overseas to Hispania to strike at the Carthaginian territories there. Thus, the war descended into a clash on multiple fronts which neither side seemed to be able to make a breakthrough in, and it went on like this year after year into the mid-200s BC. The deadlock was only finally broken from 205 BC onwards. That year, a Roman aristocrat by the name of Publius Cornelius Scipio was elected as the senior Roman magistrate, the consul, on the back of promises that he would end the long-running war. He did so by launching a direct invasion of North Africa in 204 BC and linking up with Massinissa and his Numidian armies. Over the next 2 years, Scipio devastated the country around the city of Carthage itself, shattering the Carthaginian economy and war effort. In this situation, Hannibal, who, incredibly, was still in Italy a decade and a half after first arriving to wage war there in the heart of Rome's territory, had no option but to make plans to return to North Africa with his remaining forces and confront Scipio. When he did, the outcome was disastrous. The Battle of Zama, in the plains to the southwest of the city of Carthage, was the decisive clash of the war. Here, In 202 BC, both Hannibal and Scipio had only between 30,000 and 40,000 troops each, many of them raw recruits, an indication of the toll 16 years of war had taken. Though the Carthaginians allegedly had the larger force, the Roman and Numidian cavalry proved decisive in shattering Hannibal's lines, leading to a rout and complete defeat. The following year, with the Romans laying siege to their capital city, the Carthaginians surrendered and negotiated peace terms, whereby they ceded their empire in Hispania to Rome, and were confined henceforth to a small city-state in North Africa. Rome had won, Hannibal had lost, and the Romans' ascent to become the masters of the entire Mediterranean was underway. Surprisingly, given his position as the great nemesis of Rome, the Romans did not make it a provision of the peace terms that Hannibal would be handed over to them. Instead, he ran to become the Suffet of Carthage around 200 BC once the war was over and was successful. The Suffet was the foremost magistrate of Carthage, a prime minister of sorts who was elected from amongst the heads of the aristocratic families. He was an activist leader, one who began rebuilding the Carthaginian economy as a way of paying off the large war indemnity imposed by the Romans as quickly as possible. It appears that he was adopting a similar policy to the one which his father had developed all those years ago following defeat in the First War against Rome back in 241 BC, specifically a policy of rebuilding and one day challenging Rome again. However, his countrymen had no taste for it, their spirit broken by two crushing defeats and a period between 264 BC and 201 BC where they had been at war with Rome for 43 out of 64 years in total. Consequently, they made it clear that no new war would be sought, and henceforth Carthage would remain a small mercantile state in North Africa, one which would tolerate Roman hegemony over the western Mediterranean. Hannibal would not accept this, and around 196 BC, he left Carthage and headed into exile. The degree to which this was voluntary, or whether he was forced out by the city authorities, has been extensively debated without any definitive answer being found. That Hannibal intended to continue his own personal war against Rome was clear, and after leaving Carthage, he headed east. Now that the Romans were masters of the western Mediterranean, they would potentially expand eastwards into the eastern Mediterranean. Here, Greece, Anatolia, Syria, the Levant, and Egypt were all controlled by numerous Greek and Macedonian states that had succeeded the empire of Alexander the Great. Hannibal took up employment with one of these, the Seleucid Empire, which controlled Syria, the Levant, and further territory eastwards into what was then known as Mesopotamia, but which corresponds with Iraq today. Here he became a military advisor to King Antiochus III. This Seleucid ruler is often termed Antiochus the Great. Such was the manner in which he revitalized and expanded the Seleucid Empire during his long reign. When Hannibal arrived to the east, he was conquering parts of Anatolia in what is now Turkey. This expansionism soon led to a clash with Rome after some of the Greek city-states of the region appealed to the Romans for aid against the Seleucids. Thus, the first of many wars between the Romans and the Seleucids began from 192 BC. After 4 years of conflict, the Romans emerged victorious. They did not annex territory here yet, but rather ceded their gains to smaller local Greek allies. One of the terms of the treaty was that Hannibal was to be exiled from the Seleucid Empire by Antiochus, though Hannibal feared that the Seleucid ruler would hand him over to the Romans and preemptively fled. Thus, in 188 BC, the Carthaginian general found himself again without a home and on the road. Hannibal was entering his 60s by this time, old age by the standards of the ancient world. He spent his final years as an itinerant military advisor in the east, spending time on the island of Crete and in the Kingdom of Armenia in the Caucasus before eventually settling in the Kingdom of Bithynia in Anatolia. He spent his final years here. Legend has it that his demise finally came about when the Romans applied diplomatic pressure on the Bithynians to hand Hannibal over to them. Tired of running, Hannibal allegedly swallowed poison sometime around 183 BC in his mid-60s, though whether this was a literary conceit of the historians of the time and he simply died of old age, or whether he actually committed suicide is open to debate. His career was ultimately completely unsuccessful. Rome defeated him at every step, but for a time he had been the Republic's greatest adversary and nearly changed history at the start of the Second Punic War. He would have done so had he captured the city of Rome itself after the Battle of Cannae, but it was not to be. In the decades after he died, Rome began expanding into the eastern Mediterranean and would in due course conquer all before them, including the Seleucid Empire a century after Hannibal's time. Carthage itself struggled along for another 3 decades after Hannibal's death. Then in 149 BC, the Romans declared war on it again and sent an army to North Africa. 3 years later, they captured the city of Carthage, destroyed it, sold its people into slavery, and even salted the earth where the city had stood so that nothing would grow there, in what was one of the first clearly recorded acts of genocide in history. Hannibal had been right. The Romans had to be resisted at all costs.